This is Argentina, a country that in 1908 was the 7th richest country in the world that had just surpassed Canada, Denmark, and the Netherlands. It was an export superpower that helped feed the majority of the European population. It had a stable and modern political system, and it had a well-developed education system that once had the highest literacy rate in the entire Latin America. This beautiful and historic country of Argentina is one of the best study case of what can go wrong within an economy, because everything that can go wrong did go wrong. Throughout its history, Argentina has defaulted on its debts a total of 9 times, and it seems like it's only a matter of time before another one happens. Inflation right now is at 211%, and 40.1% of the people who live below the poverty line have been unable to afford basic necessities like food, fuel, and medicine. Even worse, all of these are preventable. And had Argentina didn't make the mistakes that it made, this research estimates that Argentina's per capita income today would be on par with Canada and New Zealand, or 5 times richer than it is today, basically preventing all of its economic suffering. Sadly, the real world doesn't work that way. So, how did Argentina become one of the richest countries in the world? And what mistakes do the country make to become the mess that it is today? In this video, we're going to review the entire history of Argentina's economy and the root cause of its economic problems. This is the economy of Argentina. Alright, so to really dive deep into Argentina's economy, we need to start in the early 1600s, when Argentina was a part of the massive Spanish Empire, along with countries like Mexico, Peru, Chile, and many more. But there was something different about Argentina, because it didn't have the one thing that its invaders were looking for: gold. You see, the main reason the Spanish Empire invaded and colonized South America in the first place was to plunder the vast amounts of gold and precious metals that these regions had, and use the money to fund its armies and invade more countries in Europe and North Africa to plunder more stuff. In the 16th century, the Spanish Empire became the most powerful in the world by doing exactly this. But Argentina didn't have any gold or silver. The only natural resource Argentina has is oil. Although before the Industrial Revolution, oil wasn't valuable at all. So for the most part, the Spanish Empire just left Argentina on its own and focused on plundering the rich gold mines in Bolivia and Peru. This piece of information will be important later on, so keep that in mind. Alright, so how did the economy even work during the Spanish occupation? Well, it was primitive. A self-sufficient economy with lots of small towns and rural villages separated by hundreds of kilometers that each produces and consumes its own goods and services and conducts little trade with the outside world. Argentina back then looked more like a collection of independent cities rather than a single unified country, because it was. The Spanish Empire didn't bother to invest in infrastructure because there was nothing to exploit there. So there was no such thing as roads or ports, except for the big cities, of course. So the cities were isolated from each other, trade was limited, and most of the people were poor. We can even see Argentina's lack of trade and natural resources by counting how many slaves Argentina had. You see, during the 17th and 18th century, Latin America, like many other countries including the USA, imported a lot of slaves from Africa. Over 80% of them were forced to work either in sugar plantations or some kind of mining activity, both of which Argentina didn't have. For example, there were about 2.5 million slaves imported from Africa through Brazil during the 17th and 18th century. Argentina, meanwhile, had only 100,000 arriving at the port of Buenos Aires. Even then, most of them were just passing through Argentina to go to Chile or Paraguay. In a moral sense, this is actually a good thing. Now, one question for you. If Argentina didn't have any natural resources and had no infrastructure for conducting trade, what exactly was it good at? Or how did the country even survive? Well, it's because of agriculture. Argentina is blessed with highly fertile land and it specializes in cattle and sheep production. But Argentina has just about any agricultural products that you can think of. Today, it is the third largest producer in the world of sunflower seed, the third largest producer in the world of soy, the fourth largest producer of honey, and the sixth largest producer of lemon. And there are so many more products that I can list here. This dominance in agriculture will become an important reason why Argentina became so rich later on. Even today, it still plays a large part in helping the Argentine people to survive amidst its ongoing economic collapse. Now, it was only after Argentina declared independence in 1816 that the country started to develop a national identity and economy. But it still had a long way to go, and the country had lots of problems. For the next 50 years, Argentina was poor and extremely unstable. The economy never really got going because there were 50 years worth of civil war between the Unitarians and the Federalist faction, who disagreed on how the economy should be run. Even under the umbrella of one country, each province had its own money, and the same money had a different value from one province to another, and even among cities in the same province. The root of this problem was political instability. The government couldn't enforce the rule of law and protect property rights. Different provinces in the country were often divided and at war with each other, and the central government didn't have much power either, because different factions of the government were also at war with each other. It was only after the end of the Civil War, or about 50 years after its independence, that Argentina had some sort of political stability. And this stability will eventually set the stage for the golden age of the Argentine economy. Now, so far, I haven't really mentioned a positive thing happening to Argentina, maybe aside from praising their agriculture, because it was only after the 1860s that it was able to exploit these advantages, making the country to prosper and experiencing an economic boom that practically made it the richest country in all of Latin America. The main reason for this is trade liberalization. You see, despite its dominance in agriculture, Argentina never really fancied exporting its agricultural output and preferred to consume it themselves. But that changed after Argentina became a fully unified country. Argentina began exporting its products to Europeans and Americans on a massive scale. This research from the University of Zaragoza, for example, shows that Argentina became a super exporter from 1880 to 1929, simply because it had a diverse array of agricultural products that no other country in the world could match. Now that it opened up its economy to international trade, the country, somewhat surprisingly, found out that so many countries are willing to pay a high price for their products. The country was growing, and the people benefited massively. Wages increased rapidly as GDP per capita rose from 35% of the US to about 80% of the US in 25 years. In the 1890s, the world finally started noticing that there was this country far down in South America that had major economic potential. The profitability of Argentine agriculture has now attracted foreign investors from all over the world to invest their money and build things like railways and factories there. In the 1880s, capital investment from the British to Argentina were only worth £20 million. But 10 years later, that number reached £150 million, and this was just investments from the UK, not to mention investors from France, Germany, and Belgium who all followed suit. Now, Argentina's partnership with the UK was one of the reasons why it became so rich. 50% of all British investment outside the UK was directed there. These investors helped build new railways that bought livestock from the city outskirts and farms to the big cities like Buenos Aires. They built factories there for processing these products and then funded the shipment of goods across the world, making Argentina an export superpower that had advanced infrastructure all over the country. Now, as the economy grew, Argentina didn't have that many people to work in farms and factories, while land was easily available. So, tempted by the high wages and the opportunity to start a new life overseas, European immigrants began coming over to Argentina in droves, mostly from Italy and Spain, but there are also Poles, Russians, French, Welsh, Ukrainians, Palestinians, Turkish, Australians, and South African immigrants all coming to Argentina. At first, the government helped to subsidize immigrants to come to Argentina because they needed more people to work there. But they soon found out that even without any subsidy, immigrants kept arriving in massive numbers looking for a new and a better life. So much so that during Argentina's rapid growth era, a total of 6.6 million people immigrated to Argentina, second only to the United States, which had 27 million immigrants in the same time period. By 1913, Argentina was one of the richest countries on earth. The people's income was on par with Switzerland and far more than many European countries. It was the richest Latin American nation, and it's not even close. The Argentine capital, Buenos Aires, was a modern metropolis with big administrative buildings and extensive parks. European fashion and luxury goods were in demand, and by all accounts, the country was prospering and the people were happy. But here, the slow decline begins. In 1914, Argentina, like many other countries at the time, experienced a recession because of the breakout of World War I. Foreign investment from Europe immediately ceased, as they were focusing on their own survival first, and frankly, it never ever recovered even to this day. The UK had borrowed massively from the US to fund its armies and could no longer export Argentinian goods, and today, exactly 110 years later since the start of World War I, British investments in Argentina never reached the heights it had back then. This, in hindsight, was the moment where Argentina's economy started its slow decline. You see, Argentina was over-reliant on its agriculture and dependent on British foreign investment that poured money into building infrastructure there and shipping its goods to Europe. The status of London as the global financial center at the time also helped to instill confidence in other investors that Argentina was the right country to invest in. But after World War I, the UK had accumulated massive debt to the United States, and not to mention, it lost pretty much an entire generation of young people who got sent to the trenches of France. This, along with the USA experiencing the Roaring Twenties, eventually led to New York replacing London as the global financial center. Unlike the British, Americans weren't so high on the prospect of Argentina, so they mostly left them alone. Also in 1914, the USA successfully built and opened the Panama Canal. This greatly reduces the time for ships to travel between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, so that ships don't have to go all the way to the southernmost tip of South America. As a consequence of that, Argentina and many other Latin American countries like Brazil and Chile saw a decline in shipment traffic and consequently less demand for its exports. By the way, before we get into the eventual downfall of Argentina, it is important to mention that despite being one of the richest countries in the world, Argentina was never really an industrialized nation. Most of its citizens work in farms, not factories, and Argentina itself became rich because of agricultural exports, not manufacturing. To become a fully industrialized nation, you need to have an abundance of energy sources like coal, for example, to generate electricity and fuel. But Argentina lacked these energy sources, so it didn't really industrialize as much as countries in Europe like France, despite it being richer than France. Keep this in mind because it's very important. Now, this is where the downfall begins. In 1929, there was this economic disaster happening across the world called the Great Depression. It hit Argentina hard, not because it directly impacted the Argentine people, but because as European countries as well as the USA experienced a severe economic crisis, there were no other countries that could buy Argentina's agricultural products. As export revenues plummeted, the profitability of farms fell, lots of crops went to waste, the farmers went bankrupt, and the government had a hard time paying the public workers, causing unrest to grow within the population. Fed up with the crisis, in 1930, the military staged a coup d'etat to overthrow the democratic government in an incident known as the September Revolution. And after this moment, major changes to Argentina's politics and economics took place. Democracy was abolished, political parties were banned, and the 1853 Constitution, which laid the foundation of Argentina's political stability, was suspended. The coup marked the start of what Argentines call the infamous decade, a 13-year period in which the military ruled Argentina through repression, political corruption, and fraudulent presidential elections. Now, this is the first of many cases for the next 40 years where if Argentina is in an economic crisis and the people are unhappy, the military will overthrow whoever is in the government, take over, and do the exact opposite of what the previous government does. It's like, if capitalism doesn't work, go to socialism. If socialism doesn't work, go back to capitalism. And this goes on and on until Argentina had 6 military coups in the 20th century, where it tried every economic policy in the book, but none of them really work. Argentina, before the Great Depression, was a democratic nation and the most politically stable country in the world. But with one incident, it immediately became a hotbed for dictatorship and revolution, while becoming the most politically unstable country, at least for the next 40 years. Many would argue that this political instability is still here today. Right after the 1930 revolution, the new government abandoned the export-led growth model, which made it rich in the first place, and for the next 40 years, enacted a policy called import substitution. Basically, this is a policy that advocates a country to become self-sufficient and reduce its dependency on the outside world by producing everything locally at home, reducing exports, nationalizing private companies, and putting up protective barriers to foreign trade like high tariff and exchange controls. This approach was actually used by many Latin American countries at the time, with many economists in the 1930s believing that this approach would solve mass poverty and bring Argentina back to prosperity. However, by the 1970s, many of the economists who had advocated for import substitution became disillusioned with their own ideas and their impact to the world. By the end of this video, you can really see why. Starting from the end of World War II all the way to the 1970s, Argentina's economy was stagnating. The country closed its economy off from world markets, nationalized large part of the economy, and put up trade barriers to defend them, where businesses lack the incentives to innovate and improve the quality of their products, and large businesses often rely on political connections or bribes to obtain favors and subsidies. Argentina has now created a domestically oriented industry with almost complete protection against imports and high production costs that were incapable of competing in international markets, not to mention creating a political environment that encourages corruption. The agricultural growth that made Argentina a rich nation fell dramatically, while the living standard in rural areas deteriorated as farming wasn't as profitable anymore. This caused many farmers living in the countryside to abandon their farms and migrate to the big cities to work in factories, especially in Buenos Aires, where there were more opportunities for work. For a country so reliant on agricultural exports, the tariffs and blockades of trade were a major surprise to the population, and many people were unhappy. Now, despite all of this, Argentina's economy still wasn't so bad. And if you live in Argentina right after World War II, there was actually a lot to be optimistic about. Cutting off foreign products in Argentine shops meant that the domestic market was growing. For example, radio sales increased by 600% and fridge sales grew by 218%. And remember that I said Argentina wasn't an industrialized nation? Well, from 1946 to 1952, the hydroelectric capacity of the nation increased sevenfold, as it built 22 hydroelectric power plants to support its factories, and it built a 1,700-kilometer long gas pipeline between the town of Comodoro and Buenos Aires that increased natural gas production from 300,000 cubic meters daily to 15 million cubic meters daily, making the country practically self-sufficient in energy. At the time, that gas pipeline was the longest in the world. Not to mention, the new president Juan Perón was doing a lot of things for the country's middle class. Businesses and factories were forced to improve working conditions and provide severance pay and compensation for workplace accidents. He added the minimum wage in various sectors that didn't have a minimum wage beforehand. The working day was reduced in various industries, paid holidays were granted to the entire workforce, and he supported the labor unions as long as the labor unions pledged their support to him for the next presidential election. From 1946 to 1951, the number of Argentinians covered by Social Security more than tripled, so 70% of workers were covered by Social Security. In his first 2 years in office, Perón nationalized the central bank and immediately paid off its billion-dollar debt to the Bank of England. Argentina's GDP increased by 25% in the first 2 years of Perón's presidency, and things began to look up again. But this growth and prosperity was short-lived. Beginning in 1950, inflation became a problem because as people's wages increase, prices also increase, which led to high inflation. This is one case where increasing the people's wages all at once may not be the best thing to do. Because if that increase in wages caused inflation to increase even more, then that wage increase would be practically useless, as inflation in 1951 reached 50%. So, despite the nominal wages of people increasing, real wages, aka wages adjusted for inflation, fell. Moreover, despite the increasing quality of infrastructure, the nationalization of many foreign companies, and constant public works projects that create employment, Argentina during this time clearly overspent way beyond their means and had so many expenses to meet. For example, most state companies were unprofitable and required constant aid from the state to survive. The country had to resort to taking on debt or printing money to fund those deficits. By the way, this habit of overspending is more like an addiction to Argentina, and we can see this over and over again throughout history. In 1952, the purchasing power of Argentine workers had declined by 20%, despite its economy growing by 25% from 1946 to 1948. For the next 4 years, until 1956, Argentina's economy completely stagnated, while people, especially the working class, saw their quality of life diminish. Worse, this happened in the early 1950s, when the rest of the world was enjoying the golden era of massive economic boom as World War II ended. Argentina slid into stagflation in late 1954, inflation was at 297%, and that culminated in the working class people and the military turning against Perón. And on 16 September 1955, he resigned as the country was on the brink of another civil war. Now, in 1970, after decades of protectionist policies, years of high inflation, and a total of 5 military coups, the country was tired. and a gradual reversal in trade policy culminated in the military announcing that the import substitution experiment had failed. It is now the time to abandon protectionist policies and open the country to the world market. Unfortunately, the damage had already been done. Between 1975 and 1990, real GDP per capita fell by 20%, which basically eliminated 3 decades worth of economic progress. When Argentina opened up its economy, it found out the hard way that its companies, especially in the manufacturing industry, simply weren't able to compare with its international competitors. You see, protectionist policies did allow for some companies to grow, but they were massively inefficient and corrupt. Their products were simply no match for foreign goods entering the market, and most weren't even profitable to begin with, only surviving because of subsidies and preferential loans given by the government. So, without any protection from foreign competitors and subsidies from the government, the Argentine manufacturing sector began a process of long period of decline. Unemployment and poverty rose as workers were laid off or forced to accept lower wages. Basically, this attempt at liberalization and opening up the economy has exposed Argentina's structural economic problems, which were pretty well hidden beforehand, even to the country's leaders. So, before 1975, Argentina's per capita income was twice as high as Mexico's, and 3 times as countries like Brazil and Chile. That doesn't mean Argentina was a successful economy, but it just means that its neighboring countries were just way worse. By 1990, that gap was completely gone, and Argentina was seen as the sick man of Latin America. But perhaps the most staggering thing about Argentina at the time was just how politically unstable it was. Between 1973 and 1991, Argentina had a total of 13 presidents, if you count the interim ones, and within 18 years, the country had a total of 21 Minister of Economics. To date, the central bank has more than 60 governors. Only 2 of them actually completed their term without being fired beforehand. If the country's leaders change every single year, or worse, every few months, it's no surprise that the country lacks long-term planning. This in turn was reflected by high inflation. Now, Argentina is a country pretty familiar with high inflation, simply because it happens so often. But the inflation in the 1980s was extraordinary, even for Argentinians. In 1977, after the final military coup that led to the rise of Argentina's last dictator, the country had an annual inflation rate of 5,000%. Deficits climbed again, while its external debt tripled within 3 years. The government basically lost control of the entire nation. It was continuously bailed out by the IMF and other countries like Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Venezuela, and the United States all lent Argentina $300 million to allow the country to survive for 3 months in 1984. This crisis became even worse in 1989, when the stabilization program to contain inflation from President Alfonsín completely backfired. The country's debt burden went nuts. Hyperinflation was rampant, reaching about 12,000% at its peak. Shops were closing, posting signs stating, "We have no prices." Both domestic and foreign investment plunged, and the country experienced food shortages, which led to riots and people looting supermarkets all across the country, starting from the city of Rosario. This incident became known as the 1989 riots. More than 40 people were arrested and 14 people died. Now, after experiencing 8 currency crises from 1975 to 1990, Argentina implemented a currency board system, a policy that fixed the exchange rate of the Argentine peso to the US dollar at a 1-to-1 ratio. Basically, this means that for every peso in circulation, there was a dollar in the central bank reserves, and Argentinians who own pesos can exchange it for dollars at any time. This brought a much needed stability, as with this system in place, the country cannot print more money. Inflation went from over 1000% to below 10%. Confidence in the economy improved among the people because they know their money cannot become worthless, or even if it did, they can simply exchange it for US dollars. This also attracts foreign investment, because investors do not have to worry about exchange rate fluctuations or currency risks. But the trade-off was huge. The government cannot devalue the currency to make its goods more competitive abroad, nor can it use monetary policy to stimulate the economy. Basically, this kind of system ties up your hands behind your back, and if a recession ever happens, the government cannot do much to contain it, and instead have to follow the US monetary policy, which obviously doesn't align with Argentina's economic interests. A fixed exchange rate does very well in the short term for reducing inflation, but it cannot create long-run economic prosperity if you don't have the fundamentals of the economy right. This was proven in 1998, when Argentina fell into a deep recession. This recession was mostly from external shocks: the Asian financial crisis, the Russian financial crisis, the LTCM financial crisis in the USA that required $3.6 billion worth of bailout, and the Brazilian real devaluation in 1999 all put a toll on the Argentine economy, with concerns of whether the country could pay its debts. In 2001, a series of deposit runs began to destabilize the entire banking system. In a climate of severe political and social unrest, the country defaulted on its debts again, and in a panic, it abandoned the currency board regime. This instability led to probably the worst economic crisis Argentina has ever seen. In 2002, Argentina lost 20% of its GDP. The Argentine peso lost 75% of its value, unemployment went over 25%, and 54.3% of Argentinians were earning below the poverty line in October 2002. This was Argentina's own version of the Great Depression. So, how about Argentina's economic condition today? Well, it's quite a mess really. As of recording, the country is on the verge of its 10th debt default in history. As a country that has a long history of spending beyond its means, Argentina has received more than 20 financial aid programs since the late 1950s, and it is now the IMF largest debtor by a country mile. The people are suffering. 40.1% of its 46 million people live below the poverty line. Because the economy has been badly managed for so long, it has really created the situation for the Argentinian people where they're consistently doubting whatever policymakers are doing. Argentinians don't expect things to get better. They just expect things to get worse. And you can't really blame them, because the situation somehow keeps getting worse. The people's lack of trust in the government also extends to the currency. People no longer trust the peso and mainly use dollars. As soon as Argentinians workers get paid their salaries in pesos, they will immediately exchange those pesos into dollars, continuously making the Argentine currency depreciate against the dollar and putting pressure on inflation. So, you get a vicious cycle where eventually, inflation runs up to a completely unsustainable level, like the one we're seeing right now. Argentina was and probably still is a dysfunctional state that in its heyday over-relied on agricultural exports and unsustainable government spending that fueled some major boom and bust cycles. That resulted in extreme political instability and lack of long-term planning that today has haunted the country for nearly a century. Sure, the country has tried everything to revitalize the economy, from capitalism to socialism, from democracy to dictatorship, then back to democracy, from free market to protectionism. But all of these are useless if you don't get the fundamentals right. Simple things like having competent government institutions, providing secure property rights, or actually having the trust of the people. This is Doverhill, and see you next time.